Crisis communications is a growing area in both the government and the corporate world. How to effectively manage the message during high-profile situations. John Larsen's been here every Wednesday this summer to help us understand crisis communications. He's a principal with the Corpin Group, a Calgary public relations firm. His topic this week was prompted by this news story.
Police say 3 people now in custody are part of a domestic terrorism group, that they had the intent to commit a violent criminal act, and that the bombs were the weapons they planned to use.
That's coverage from last week of the alleged terrorism plot that was uncovered in Ottawa. So how do officials release information about high-risk situations to what, well, John says is an often sensitive general public? John Larsen's here. Good morning.
Good morning, David.
Often sensitive. Are we that sensitive? Is the public that sensitive?
Yeah, it can be, and that's not meant to be a pejorative term or to be insulting to the public. So I just think sometimes people, they don't know what they should be worried about. Oftentimes there's an issue of trust in terms of the message that's coming out, and sometimes they just get the sense that they don't really know the full story. So being sensitive about these sorts of things, yeah, absolutely they are.
All right. So when should organizations, and by that I mean who? I mean governments, I mean corporations, large organized groups that control information. Yeah. When should they talk to the public about risk? What should be their gauge?
Yeah, well, it's about an obligation. Society now has this much higher expectation of accountability in terms of talking about these sorts of things and communicating to us. And I think you can look at a couple of different things. Number one, is it in the public interest? There are all kinds of risk communications that go on right now. We see it if you have emergency planning zones, for example, for sour gas. You have to communicate around that. But beyond that, you have to ask the question, is there really a debate about harm? And I think, David, we saw that earlier this week when a report came out about potential toxogens and whatnot in the Athabasca water levels. So that is an ongoing conversation between one group and the Alberta government as to how severe that is and whatnot. And so that is risk communications at its core.
Isn't the debate about harm, isn't that in some way ruled by how much the public already knows? It seems like a bit of a circle. I mean, who decides what is or is not acceptable risk here?
The public decides what's acceptable risk, and that's really a mental construct. So what the public does is they look at a couple of things and they say, how much do I need something? People are willing to accept risk if they understand that they need something. They also have to have a fairly clear understanding of what damage and reward is. So if I undertake this risk, or if I look at this risk, what's the damage, but what's the reward back to me? And at the end of the day, it's about likelihood. And that's something that I think organizations sometimes need to do a better job explaining to people, is what's the likelihood of something? Because we make these decisions from a very emotive perspective. It's a very emotional process when we think about risk, as opposed to more of a scientific or logical perspective.
Mm-hmm. But it still comes down to, deciding how much information to give to the public and defining in the public eye how much that risk is. I'm thinking about BP, for example. At first it was a small spill, then it became a bigger spill. And I don't think the facts changed. It's just how much information was released. I mean, in your view, what's the most common mistake companies make when they discuss risk?
Absolutely, they downplay the risk. They minimize the risk.
That's what we saw in BP.
Absolutely. And they downplay the severity of the consequence. I mean, one of the things that we have to do when we talk to people about risk is we have to provide them with some context. We have to bring them into that conversation. If we don't do that, we essentially insult the legitimate concerns of publics. And we've seen that before. And if we do that, we sometimes have this sort of tone of condescension. The example that can be used is we do open houses, we bring scientists in, we put them on the 2-foot stage, and they stand up in a suit and tie and they talk down to everybody else. And they essentially say, don't worry about things. Having said that, the scientific facts behind it are important, but that's not what mobilizes people to think about things in a different way. It's that trust quotient, and you touched on that before, and it really, really is important. An example here that just came up recently is Bruce Power, a nuclear power company out of Ontario, is shipping some equipment around. And this is the stuff that they've done many, many times before. It's the type of stuff that's done in Europe all the time. But because there's a very emotional debate around it now, it's becoming very difficult for them to do what they've done for many, many years before. So the science behind it hasn't changed. The emotion behind it has changed drastically, and the way that company is now looking at having to communicate is a lot different than how it was in the past.
So this is tough I'm sure it depends on corporate culture as much as anything else, how a company chooses to deliver their message. But they're stuck in the role where they have to give the information, but at the same time seem open to hearing what other people have to say about it, which can be tough if your particular corporate culture is all about telling people what to do, thank you very much, and moving the ship in that direction. So in your view, what are the ingredients of effective risk communications? What actually works?
Well, a couple of things. Number one is the people that are talking about risk, they have to be on the same page. You mentioned BP, David, and I know we've talked a lot about it on this program, but one of the things is that there have been two different voices on this thing in terms of how much oil is there out there on the Gulf Coast. There have been two large organizations that have said different things. That confuses publics tremendously. We also saw that in H1N1 just about a year ago, where we had different messages coming from international and national sources. So, number one, people have to be on the same page, and a lot of effort has to be put into getting people on the same page. The other thing you have to do is you have to bring people into the debate. You have to allow people to shape the content of what you're actually talking about. There's a lot of talk out there in organizations and in corporations about dialogue, but when you boil it down, it's really not dialogue, it's monologue. It's people talking to publics. So we need to make sure that those publics are brought in. And at the end of the day, you have to provide more information. Again, if we just go back to this Athabasca water debate, one of the big contentious issues right now is how much do we know? And are people holding certain pieces of information back? That is not healthy when you're dealing with risk communications. If you allow people to take the information to interpret for themselves, they will actually accept far more risk than if you hold that information back. Just
quickly, is the public pretty savvy, though? I mean, can they smell now when a corporation is putting on the appearance, or a government putting on the appearance of being inclusive, of hearing what people have to say?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think generally publics are more savvy. There are a lot of things that are pushing that. Social media. I mean, you've got these conversations going on social media. Before, you would think about it on your own terms. You might talk to one or two friends, maybe read an article. Now, instantaneously, you get the opinions of hundreds of people, so they could cross-correlate so much more quickly, and organizations just aren't up to speed in taking care of that.
Interesting. John, thanks for this. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Dave.
That's John Larsen. He's a principal with the Corcoran Group, a public relations firm right here in Calgary. He's been joining us throughout the summer to shed a light on crisis communications.